Queen Elizabeth II's coffin has been lowered into the royal vault at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, bringing to a close the public funeral for a monarch whose 70-year reign defined an age. King Charles III placed the colour of the Grenadier Guards on the Queen's coffin, and looked teary-eyed as the hours-long service came to a close. The Lord Chamberlain broke his wand of office and placed it on the coffin before it was lowered into the vault. Read more. George and Charlotte play key roles in funeral moments earlier. The imperial state crown, the orb and the scepter were removed from their place on the Queen's coffin by the crown jeweler and handed to the Dean of Windsor. It was a symbolic moment as the Queen was separated from crown jewels, bringing an end to her 70 years of service that she pledged as a young princess. The items will eventually be returned to the Tower of London. The Queen was then taken to King George VI Memorial Chapel for a private burial, laid to rest alongside her late husband Prince Philip. The events of the day began at sunrise when the doors of Parliament's 900-year-old Westminster Hall were closed to mourners after hundreds of thousands had filed in front of the Queen's coffin. Monday was declared a public holiday in honor of Elizabeth, who died on September 8, and hundreds of thousands of people descended on central London to partake in the historic moment. They jammed the sidewalks to watch the coffin wind its way through the streets of the capital after the service. As the procession passed Buckingham Palace, the Queen's official residence in the city, staff stood outside, some bowing and curtsying. State funeral at Westminster Abbey. The Queen's coffin was taken from Westminster Hall across the road to Westminster Abbey, on a royal gun carriage drawn by 142 Royal Navy sailors. The same carriage was used to carry the coffins of late Kings Edward VII, George V and George VI, and of Winston Churchill. The Queen's coffin sat the center of the Abbey after being borne by pallbearers and accompanied by her son King Charles III and other members of the royal family. They included Prince William, his wife Catherine, Princess of Wales, and their two elder children George, 9 and Charlotte, 7. Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, also walked behind the coffin. William and Catherine's youngest son, Louis, was not in attendance. Dean of Westminster David Hoyle opened the service in the ancient abbey, where Elizabeth was married and crowned. We gather from across the nation, from the Commonwealth, and from the nations of the world, to mourn our loss, to remember her long life of selfless service, and ensure confidence to commit her to the mercy of God our Maker and Redeemer, he said. The new UK Prime Minister Liz Truss gave the second reading, a passage from John 14, 1-9. Read more. King Charles III didn't get involved in preparations for him to become king. The opening hymn at the funeral was "The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is Ended." The hymn was written in 1870 by Reverend John Ellerton. It was also sung at the Diamond Jubilee celebrations for Queen Victoria in 1897, and remains a popular church hymn in Britain. The second hymn, "The Lord's My Shepherd," was sung at her wedding in 1947. The third hymn, "Love Divine, All Loves Excelling," is written by Charles Wesley, perhaps the most significant hymn writer in English history. The song was also performed at the wedding of William and Catherine in 2011. Most of the senior royals were wearing military uniforms at the funeral, including King Charles, Prince Edward, Princess Anne, and Prince William. Prince Andrew and Prince Harry wore civilian suits. The coffin was carried by 10 pallbearers who were all former equerries, or attendants of the royal household. U.S. President Joe Biden and his wife Jill and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese were among the notable foreign attendees, along with former British Prime Ministers Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and Theresa May. Princesses Eugenie and Beatrice arrived with their mother Duchess Sarah. Zara Tindall and husband Mike Tindall also attended. The queue to see the Queen lying in state at Westminster Hall, where it has been since September 14, was closed to mourners many hours before the funeral. Many people had spent cold nights outdoors to pay their respects around the Queen's flag-draped coffin in a moving outpouring of national grief and respect. The closing of the hall marked the end of more than 4 days of the coffin lying in state and the start of the UK's first state funeral since the one held in 1965 for Churchill, the first of 15 prime ministers during Elizabeth's reign. 2 days before her September 8 death at her Balmoral summer retreat, the Queen appointed her last Prime Minister, Truss. The last member of the public to view Queen Elizabeth II's coffin as it lay in state at the Houses of Parliament was Chrissy Heary, a serving member of the Royal Air Force from Melton Mowbray. "It felt like a real privilege to do that," Heary said. She said Monday she went through Westminster Hall twice, the first time in the early hours of the morning and then again just before its doors closed to mourners at 6:30 am. She said the experience was one of the highlights of my life and I feel very privileged to be here. Monday was declared a public holiday in the UK in honour of Elizabeth, who died at 96. In Australia, a public holiday will be observed on Thursday. The day of mourning takes place once the Prime Minister returns from the funeral in London. Read more. Prince George, Princess Charlotte to attend great-grandmother's funeral. Final procession through London. Following the state funeral, members of the royal family marched behind the Queen's coffin for a procession to Wellington Arch, where the coffin was transferred to a hearse. The heirs took the monarch's coffin the 32 kilometers to Windsor Castle. Dense crowds packed the route through the heart of ceremonial London, and thousands more lined the more workaday suburban roads to see the hearse. By the time the hearse arrived in Windsor, floral tributes thrown from the sides of roads covered its windscreen. Thousands of people lined both sides of the long walk in front of Windsor Castle as a military procession escorted the coffin to St. George's Chapel for a second, smaller service. Silence fell among the sea of mourners as the sound of drummers grew louder, and many at the back of the crowd raised their phones high in the air to try to get a glimpse of the scene. With Associated Press,